Every town hides something ugly beneath its peaceful surface. Some bury it under decades of silence. Others hide it behind smiling neighbors, tidy lawns, and quiet streets where nothing ever seems to happen. But in the spring of 1998, the small mountain town of Ashbrook, Tennessee, became the center of a nightmare that would haunt investigators for years. Deputy Ryan Mercer had worked the early patrol shift for almost 5 years. His route rarely changed. Every morning before sunrise, he drove through the winding roads surrounding Blackwood Ridge State Park, checked the empty picnic areas, inspected the hiking access points, and made sure no teenagers had spent the night drinking near the cliffs. Most mornings were uneventful. Sometimes he spotted deer crossing through the fog or campers brewing coffee beside their RVs. That was usually the most exciting thing he saw. But on April 18th, the silence of Blackwood Ridge carried a different feeling. The air was damp from overnight rain, and a low fog drifted through the trees as Mercer's cruiser crawled along the overlook road. His headlights swept across the gravel parking area near the Southern Trail entrance when something unusual caught his eye. A large suitcase sat beside a trash barrel near the edge of the woods. At first, Mercer assumed somebody had dumped old luggage there. Tourists abandoned junk all the time. But this looked expensive. Old-fashioned, maybe, with dark leather straps and brass corners dulled with age. It looked heavy, too, far too heavy to simply toss aside. Mercer parked the cruiser and stepped out slowly, boots crunching against wet gravel. The fog curled around him as he approached the suitcase. Something immediately felt wrong. Not because of the suitcase itself, but because of the stillness around it. The woods were silent. No birds, no wind, nothing. He nudged the suitcase with his boot. It barely moved. That uneasy feeling in his stomach tightened instantly. Ryan crouched beside it and noticed faint scratches near the lock, as if someone had forced it shut too quickly. He hesitated for a second before unclipping the brass latches. The smell hit him first. Rotten, sweet, heavy. The kind of smell that immediately tells your brain something terrible is waiting inside. Mercer pulled the lid open slowly. Inside was a dark blue duffel bag folded awkwardly into the suitcase. Its zipper sat halfway open, and through that small opening, illuminated by his flashlight, he saw a human eye staring back at him. Deputy Mercer stumbled backward, nearly falling onto the gravel. His pulse exploded in his ears as he called for backup with trembling hands. By sunrise, the overlook had transformed into a full crime scene. Investigators carefully removed the body from the suitcase while photographers documented every inch of the area. The victim was an elderly man, severely underweight, curled tightly into a fetal position to fit inside the duffel bag. His gray hair was thin and patchy. His face looked sunken, almost skeletal. But what disturbed investigators wasn't just that he was dead. It was how long he appeared to have suffered before dying. Bruises covered his arms and ribs. Several cuts along his wrists showed signs of healing, meaning they had happened days or even weeks earlier. Fresh abrasions marked his ankles. His nail polish was broken. One shoulder appeared dislocated. The medical examiner later concluded that the victim had been drugged repeatedly before death. High concentrations of sedatives were found in his bloodstream, enough to keep him weak and disoriented for extended periods. This wasn't a quick murder. Someone had slowly dismantled this man piece by piece before finally discarding him like garbage beside a hiking trail. The investigation immediately ran into a wall. No identification, no wallet, no jewelry, no fingerprints in any criminal database. Nothing. The old man was a ghost. Detectives searched missing persons reports across Tennessee, Kentucky, and North Carolina. They interviewed nursing homes, veterans hospitals, shelters, and retirement communities. Nobody recognized him. Weeks became months. Months became years, and the unidentified victim became known only as the Blackwood suitcase John Doe. The suitcase itself became one of the few physical clues investigators had. Detectives examined every inch of it, hoping to trace where it came from. Most of the evidence seemed useless until one young evidence technician noticed something strange along the outer leather panel. Small stains, bright red nail polish. At first, it seemed insignificant, probably old cosmetic damage, but investigators photographed the stains anyway, documenting their exact shape and placement. At the time, nobody realized those tiny marks would eventually expose an entire web of manipulation, fraud, and murder. As media coverage spread, the public became fascinated by the mystery. Who was the old man? Why had nobody reported him missing? How could somebody disappear completely without family or friends searching for them? The questions disturbed people because they forced them to confront something terrifying. The idea that a person could spend an entire lifetime building relationships, memories, and experiences only to vanish without anyone noticing. For nearly 6 years, detectives had no answers. Then, in 2004, everything changed. A newly expanded military fingerprint archive finally produced a match. The victim's name was Walter Elias Grayson, and his story made the case infinitely darker. Walter Grayson had been born in rural Georgia in 1923. Like many young men of his generation, he grew up during the Great Depression, learning how to survive with very little. When World War II began, Walter enlisted in the Army at just 19 years old. He fought across Europe, survived artillery shelling, watched friends die beside him, and somehow made it home alive. After the war, Walter settled in North Carolina, where he spent decades working at a small machine repair shop. He married young, raised 2 stepchildren, and lived a modest life defined by routine and discipline. Neighbors described him as quiet but generous, the type of man who fixed people's lawnmowers for free and always remembered birthdays. But after his wife Eleanor died from cancer in the late 1980s, Walter changed. The cheerful old mechanic slowly became isolated, lonely, vulnerable. And that vulnerability eventually attracted the worst possible person. Investigators discovered that in the final years of Walter's life, his financial behavior became bizarre. The cautious veteran who once clipped grocery coupons suddenly refinanced his paid-off house 2 times. He withdrew large amounts of cash, bought expensive luxury sedan, opened multiple credit cards despite living entirely on retirement income. Then came the most disturbing discovery of all. Even years after Walter's body had been found inside the suitcase, somebody was still cashing his pension checks. The money trail led investigators to a post office box in Maryland and to a woman named Diane Mercer. At first glance, Diane appeared harmless, friendly, polite, middle-aged. She worked in funeral pre-planning sales, traveling between towns helping elderly residents purchase burial packages and insurance policies. But behind the warm smile lived a predator who had spent decades perfecting the art of deception, and Walter Grayson had become her final masterpiece. By the time detectives first sat across from Diane Mercer in the winter of 2004, she already knew why they were there. The moment investigators mentioned Walter Grayson's name, her expression changed for only half a second. It was brief, almost invisible, but seasoned detectives noticed those things. Her smile tightened. Her fingers stopped moving. Then, just as quickly, the performance resumed. She acted confused at first, then emotional, then offended. Walter, according to Diane, had been a dear friend, almost like family. She claimed she had only tried to help an aging widower who struggled to care for himself after his wife died. She described him as forgetful and unstable, insisting he often wandered off or forgot basic tasks. At one point, she even suggested he may have disappeared voluntarily, but investigators already knew she was lying. The financial records told a different story. Over a 3-year period, Diane had systematically drained Walter's entire life savings. She convinced him to refinance his home multiple times. She opened credit cards in his name. She manipulated him into purchasing expensive items he never used. including a luxury vehicle neighbors said they never once saw him drive. Then, shortly before his death, Walter sold his house, yet almost none of the money ever reached his own bank account. Instead, investigators discovered it had been funneled into accounts connected to Diane through layers of forged paperwork and fraudulent transfers. The deeper detectives dug, the uglier the picture became. Diane Mercer had done this before. Years earlier, she had financially ruined two former husbands through fake loans, forged signatures, and hidden debt. One ex-husband declared bankruptcy after discovering nearly $90,000 in fraudulent credit accounts under his name. Another lost his business after Diane secretly redirected mortgage payments into her personal account for nearly a year. And somehow, despite repeated arrests for fraud-related offenses across several counties, she had always escaped with minor penalties. Small fines, probation, a few weeks in jail at most, nothing serious enough to stop her. But Walter's case was different, because Walter hadn't just lost his money, he had lost his life. As investigators reconstructed Walter's final months, an horrifying timeline began to emerge. In early 1997, Diane convinced Walter to move into her home temporarily after claiming his health was declining. Friends noticed immediate changes. Walter stopped answering phone calls. Church members said he suddenly disappeared from weekly services. His stepdaughter later told detectives that whenever she tried contacting him, Diane always answered instead. "He's resting. He's confused today. He doesn't want visitors." At the time, nobody questioned it. Walter was elderly, frail, recently grieving. Diane had carefully positioned herself as his caretaker. In reality, she was isolating him. One former neighbor described briefly seeing Walter during those months and barely recognizing him. He looked thinner, weak, nervous. His hands trembled constantly. The toxicology report from the autopsy suddenly made horrifying sense. Detectives concluded Diane had been sedating Walter repeatedly over an extended period. Prescription records showed she acquired large quantities of sleeping medication from multiple doctors by claiming severe anxiety and insomnia. Many of those pills were never accounted for. Then came the final week. Investigators believed Walter had become a problem Diane could no longer manage. She had recently begun dating another man named Leonard Hale, a wealthy insurance broker from Baltimore. Friends described Diane as obsessed with maintaining appearances around Leonard. Walter, old and sickly, no longer fit the image she wanted. He had become a liability, and Diane Mercer had never tolerated liabilities. According to prosecutors, Walter spent his final days heavily drugged inside Diane's home while she finalized plans to erase him permanently. Medical experts later testified that his emaciated condition suggested prolonged neglect and starvation. At some point during the night of April 16, 1998, Walter Grayson died. Whether from overdose, neglect, or physical assault was difficult to determine because of the condition of the remains, but investigators believe Diane panicked afterward. She stuffed his body into a duffel bag, forced it inside the old suitcase, and drove nearly 6 hours before abandoning him near Blackwood Ridge State Park. What she failed to realize was that the suitcase itself would ultimately destroy her. When detectives showed photographs of the suitcase publicly during the investigation, Diane's own daughter contacted police almost immediately. She recognized it instantly, not because of the shape, not because of the color, but because of the red nail polish stains along the leather corner. Years earlier, the suitcase had belonged to her. Those stains happened accidentally during high school while painting her nails before prom. That single detail shattered Diane's entire story. Suddenly, prosecutors had something concrete linking her directly to the body disposal. And once investigators obtained warrants for Diane's financial records, storage lockers, and electronic documents, the case exploded wide open. Inside one storage locker, detectives found boxes containing stolen identities, forged checks, credit applications, military records, and Social Security documents belonging to multiple elderly victims. Walter was not her first target, just the one who ended up dead. The arrest finally came in February 2005. News cameras crowded outside Diane's suburban townhouse as federal agents escorted her into custody. Even then, she maintained the same calm expression. No panic, no remorse. Neighbors were stunned. She baked cookies for everyone at Christmas. She helped organize charity drives. She seemed so normal. That was what disturbed people most about Diane Mercer. Not rage, not violence, but how ordinary she appeared. Her trial began 4 years later after endless financial investigations and delays. Prosecutors presented Diane as a calculated predator who targeted lonely elderly men for profit before discarding them once they became inconvenient. The defense attempted to portray Walter as mentally unstable and financially irresponsible, arguing Diane merely tried to help him manage his affairs. The jury didn't buy it. Witness after witness described Diane's manipulative behavior. Former partners testified about fraud schemes nearly identical to what happened with Walter. Financial experts explained how she systematically drained his assets. Medical professionals described the horrifying condition of his body. Then came testimony from Walter's stepdaughter. Through tears, she described the last normal conversation she ever had with him. He sounded tired, afraid, quietly confused. Before hanging up, he told her something she never forgot. "I think I made a mistake trusting somebody." The courtroom fell silent. After 6 hours of deliberation, the jury found Diane Mercer guilty on 20 counts, including murder, identity theft, wire fraud, and abuse of a vulnerable adult. She received life in prison without parole. But the case left scars far beyond the courtroom. For investigators, Walter Grayson became a symbol of how easily vulnerable people can disappear when manipulated by the wrong person. Investigators later admitted the case haunted them because the murder itself was only part of the horror. The real nightmare was the slow destruction beforehand, the isolation, the manipulation, the betrayal. Walter survived a world war only to die alone inside a suitcase at the hands of someone he trusted. In October 2009, more than a decade after his body was discovered beside Blackwood Ridge State Park, Walter finally received the burial he deserved. With full military honors, veterans stood beside his coffin as a bugler played softly beneath gray autumn skies. Investigators who worked the case attended quietly in the background, watching as soldiers folded the American flag with careful precision. For years, Walter Grayson had been nothing more than a nameless body inside a suitcase. Now, at last, he was remembered properly. And as the crowd slowly dispersed from the cemetery that afternoon, one detective reportedly stood staring at the grave for several long minutes before quietly saying, "Monsters don't always look dangerous. Sometimes they smile at you first." Long before cars existed, young couples always searched hidden places where nobody could watch them. Empty riverbanks, dirt trails, abandoned fields, quiet roads beyond town limits. Places where they could escape strict parents, gossiping neighbors, and the judging eyes of small communities. By the late 1900s, those places had become known everywhere as lovers' lanes. Most people think of them as harmless. Teenagers kissing beneath the stars, secret romances, late-night conversations inside parked cars. But over the years, those isolated roads became hunting grounds for something far darker, because predators understand privacy better than anyone. And on a humid August night in 1993, two young people drove into one of those lonely back roads outside the city of Bellevue, Texas, never realizing somebody was already waiting for them there. 22-year-old Lauren Mitchell had always been the kind of person who made life lighter for everyone around her. Friends described her as energetic, endlessly optimistic and impossible to stay angry at. She had a loud laugh that filled rooms and a habit of making strangers feel like old friends within minutes. Lauren grew up just outside Houston in a modest neighborhood alongside her younger sister, Emma. Their mother worked double shifts as a nurse, while their father managed a small tire shop. Money was often tight, but the Mitchell household never lacked warmth. By 1993, Lauren had recently graduated from college and started working as an assistant at a local eye clinic while figuring out what she wanted from life. Her dream changed every few months. Some days she talked about becoming a teacher. Other days she wanted to travel across Europe. But one thing remained constant. She wanted a family someday, a stable life, something real. Then, during the summer of that year, she met Daniel Reeves. Daniel had recently moved to Bellevue from North Carolina. At 23, he carried a quiet confidence people naturally gravitated toward. Tall, athletic, with dark hair and calm eyes, he worked part-time at a gym while preparing to start engineering classes at the local university. Unlike Lauren, Daniel grew up in chaos. His father, Raymond Reeves, owned several nightclubs across Texas and had a reputation for violence, gambling, and drug connections. Daniel spent much of his childhood bouncing between relatives while his father disappeared in and out of legal trouble. Despite that upbringing, somehow Daniel turned out different, gentler, disciplined, determined not to become his father. The night Daniel met Lauren happened completely by accident. A mutual friend dragged Lauren to a crowded nightclub downtown called the Velvet Room. Loud music pounded through the building while cigarette smoke floated beneath flashing lights. Lauren almost didn't go that night. She had work the next morning and originally planned to stay home watching movies with her sister. But by midnight, she was standing near the bar laughing at something Daniel had just said. And from that moment on, neither of them wanted to be apart. Friends later described their relationship as intense from the very beginning, the kind of connection people usually spend years searching for. Lauren's sister remembered watching them together and joking that they acted like newlyweds after only 2 weeks. Daniel adored her. Lauren practically glowed around him. For the first time in years, both of them felt certain about the future. On August 14, 1993, the couple went on a double date with Lauren's sister Emma and her boyfriend Tyler. The four spent the evening driving around Bellevue before eventually ending up at a nightclub just outside the city. Witnesses later recalled Lauren and Daniel dancing together most of the night, laughing, holding hands, completely lost in each other. Around 11:45 p.m., Emma teased her sister jokingly, "You two seriously need a room." Lauren laughed, rolled her eyes, and threw a napkin at her. About 15 minutes later, Lauren and Daniel left the club alone in Daniel's white Honda Accord. It was the last time anyone saw them alive. The following morning, Emma stopped by Lauren's apartment expecting to pick her up for brunch, but Lauren never came home. At first, nobody panicked. Emma assumed her sister stayed overnight with Daniel somewhere. But by afternoon, concern started turning into fear. Lauren missed work without calling. Daniel stopped answering his phone. Neither had contacted friends or family. Then, around 5:30 that evening, a private security guard patrolling an industrial road near Hollow Creek noticed an abandoned car parked near the woods. It was Daniel's Honda. The area was well known locally as a lover's lane, hidden behind overgrown pine trees and abandoned utility roads. Teenagers often parked there late at night because police rarely patrolled the area. At first, the security guard ignored the vehicle, but later, during another patrol, the car was still there. This time, he approached. The windows were rolled down, the keys remained in the ignition, both front seats were reclined backward. Lauren's purse sat on the passenger floorboard beside one of her shoes. Then the guard noticed blood smeared across the inside of the door. He immediately called police. Before officers even arrived, The guard found a contact number inside Lauren's purse and called her mother directly. Within 30 minutes, Lauren's family reached the scene, and what followed became one of the most horrifying crime scenes Bellevue investigators had ever witnessed. Police dogs began tracking scent trails into the woods shortly before midnight. The deeper they moved through the trees, the quieter the officers became. Then one of the dogs stopped abruptly beside a cluster of cedar branches, roughly 200 yards from the abandoned car. Beneath the branches lay Lauren Mitchell's body. Her mother's scream echoed through the trees the moment officers confirmed her identity. Several detectives later admitted they never forgot that sound. Lauren had been brutally murdered. Her clothing had been partially cut away. Her wrists were tightly bound behind her back with rough rope. Deep wounds marked her neck. Evidence immediately suggested she had fought desperately for her life. But the killer had done something else, something strange, something theatrical. Investigators discovered Daniel's golf clubs laid carefully along the forest floor, leading directly toward Lauren's body, like arrows pointing to the scene. And hanging from nearby tree branches were several silver balloons swaying gently in the night breeze. Placed beside Lauren's body was a crisp $10 bill, weighted beneath a stone. It looked less like a murder scene and more like a display, as if the killer wanted police to see it, wanted them to remember it. The Bellevue Lovers Lane murders quickly dominated local news. Parents became terrified. Teenagers avoided Hollow Creek completely. Rumors spread across the city about a serial killer stalking isolated roads. But despite dozens of interviews and countless leads, the investigation slowly began falling apart. Because somewhere out there, the person responsible simply vanished back into ordinary life. As summer faded into autumn, fear settled over Bellevue like a storm cloud that refused to move on. Parents stopped letting teenagers stay out late. Police increased patrols near isolated roads and wooded areas. Local newspapers printed Lauren and Daniel's photographs almost daily beneath headlines asking the same question over and over again. Who killed them? But weeks turned into months, and investigators remained trapped in the same dead end. The crime scene itself felt almost intentionally confusing. The balloons, the carefully arranged golf clubs, the money left beside Lauren's body. None of it made sense. Detectives debated endlessly whether the objects held symbolic meaning or whether the killer simply enjoyed creating chaos. Behavioral analysts eventually suggested the display pointed toward somebody who wanted control over the investigation itself, someone who enjoyed watching police struggle to understand him. That possibility terrified investigators even more, because it suggested the murders weren't random. It suggested performance, and people who kill for performance often kill again. DNA evidence recovered from Lauren's body became the investigation's strongest lead, but in 1993, the technology was frustratingly primitive. The sample was preserved and entered into state records, but there were no matches, nothing. Meanwhile, detectives pursued every possible suspect manually. Former boyfriends, co-workers, drifters, known offenders living nearby. Even Daniel's father, Raymond Reeves, briefly drew attention because of his criminal connections and violent history. Some investigators wondered whether Daniel had somehow entangled in one of his father's dangerous dealings, but no evidence linked Raymond to the murders. The case slowly went cold. For Lauren's family, the silence became unbearable. Her mother kept Lauren's bedroom untouched for years. Emma later admitted she still expected her sister to walk through the front door sometimes, laughing about some misunderstanding. Daniel's relatives suffered differently, because beneath their grief sat another horrible thought. What if Daniel failed to protect Lauren? Investigators believed he had likely been restrained while hearing her scream nearby in the darkness. Friends said Daniel would have died trying to save her if he could. That knowledge haunted everyone who loved him. Years passed. Then, in 2002, nearly 9 years after the murders, Bellevue police received a strange handwritten letter. The envelope contained no return address. Inside was a single page written in uneven block letters. You want the truth about Hollow Creek? Pay for it. $50,000 cash. Then maybe you'll learn what happened to the boy and girl. The letter instructed investigators to place a coded response inside the newspaper's classified section if they were interested. Detectives immediately believed the writer might be connected to the murders, or at least know something significant. Police secretly responded through the newspaper exactly as instructed, but whoever sent the letter never contacted them again. Some investigators believed it was simply a cruel hoax created by somebody exploiting the tragedy for money. Others weren't so sure, because certain details inside the letter had never been released publicly, including the exact positioning of the balloons. Still, the lead eventually went nowhere. By 2005, the Hollow Creek murders had become one more unsolved case buried beneath shelves of dusty files. Then, technology finally caught up. Advances in DNA testing allowed forensic analysts to re-examine the biological evidence collected from Lauren's body more than a decade earlier. And this time, the sample matched DNA recovered from another violent crime committed only 2 months before Lauren and Daniel were murdered. The linked case involved a 26-year-old cocktail waitress attacked inside her own townhouse in western Houston. The similarities between both crimes immediately alarmed investigators. According to police records, the woman returned home alone around 2 a.m. after finishing work at a nightclub. While eating dinner downstairs, she suddenly heard footsteps above her. A masked intruder emerged holding a revolver. The man demanded money and repeatedly asked where her boyfriend was. When she insisted she was alone, the intruder tied her wrists with duct tape and sexually assaulted her while threatening to shoot her repeatedly. Before leaving, he disconnected the phone line and warned her not to contact police. Despite the mask, the victim provided investigators with a detailed description. White male, late 20s to mid-30s, approximately 6 feet tall, athletic build, dark hair, calm voice. Most importantly, she described his posture as military-like, controlled, disciplined, almost emotionless. Investigators immediately noticed similarities to the Hollow Creek murders, especially the offender's need for domination and psychological terror. The DNA connection confirmed one terrifying fact. Lauren and Daniel's killer was almost certainly still alive, and possibly responsible for additional crimes nobody had connected yet. Detectives reopened the case aggressively. They reviewed old witness statements and discovered something previously overlooked. The assault victim had once worked briefly at a nightclub owned by Daniel's father years earlier. Suddenly, investigators began asking a chilling question. Was the killer somehow connected to Daniel's family? Or had he simply crossed paths with the victims by coincidence? Unfortunately, the answer never came. Even after national databases expanded dramatically, the DNA profile failed to match anyone. No arrests, no suspect, nothing. Then another disappearance complicated the mystery further. In 1995, 2 years after the Hollow Creek murders, a 24-year-old waitress named Melissa Grant vanished after leaving a nightclub only miles from where Lauren and Daniel had last been seen. She was blonde, around the same age as Lauren, last seen after midnight, and like Lauren, she disappeared near isolated industrial roads outside Bellevue. Melissa was never found. Over time, investigators quietly began considering the possibility that a serial predator had operated across the Houston region throughout the early 1990s. Several young women vanished under similar circumstances during that period. Late-night disappearances, nightclub connections, remote locations. Some were eventually found murdered, Others disappeared completely. But without stronger evidence, police could never definitively link the crimes. And so the Hollow Creek murders remained suspended in uncertainty, a nightmare without an ending. In 2018, Bellevue investigators released an updated age-progressed sketch based on the original assault victim's description combined with modern forensic analysis. The image showed a man likely in his 50s now, older, heavier, grayer, but with the same cold eyes. Police hoped someone might finally recognize him. Nobody did. Today, more than 30 years later, Lauren Mitchell and Daniel Reeves' murders remain officially unsolved. Their families still wait for answers that may never come. Emma Mitchell eventually gave interviews describing how grief changes shape over time. She said quietly during one documentary interview, "At first you cry because they're gone. Then years pass, and you start crying because the world kept moving without them." Daniel's cousin spoke even more bluntly. "Whoever did this got to wake up every morning and continue living life like nothing happened. That's the part that eats at you." Perhaps the most unsettling part of the case is the possibility that the killer never stopped. Maybe he blended quietly back into society. Maybe he married, had children, worked ordinary jobs. Maybe people smiled and shook his hand every single day without realizing what he once did in those woods beside Hollow Creek in 1993. And somewhere, perhaps sitting quietly in a suburban home decades later, an aging man still remembers the sound of terrified screams echoing through pine trees on a hot Texas night in 1993, while everyone else is left wondering who he really was.